Greetings, my fellow ghosts and goblins. I'm Tom, and welcome to Monster Gab, where we love to talk about classic and vintage horror. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some of my favourite horror-based games. Be it video games, computer games, whatever you want to call them. Games. I don't know. Just not board games. Although that would be a good subject for another video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. Now, most of the games in this list are going to be of the retro variety. Not that I have anything against modern games, I love playing modern games too, but I am kind of old school and I just prefer the retro stuff. Maybe it's partly because of nostalgia, but I just kind of prefer the way they control and handle and just the way they look, just everything about them. I'm a sucker for retro games. So kicking it off then, I know this is a bit typical and covered by many other YouTubers, but I can't start this list without mentioning the Castlevania series, especially the trilogy on the NES. Now, Castlevania has spun multiple sequels and remakes on various consoles over the years due to its cult following and huge fan base, not to mention a popular TV series on Netflix, which is absolutely brilliant by the way. But if you were to ask me which is the best in the series, well, I haven't played them all, but personally I would say Super Castlevania 4 on the Super NES is probably the best, well at least in my opinion anyway. That's not to say that it's my favourite though. Personally, I'm a big fan of the original trilogy on the NES. Now most people say that the third installment is the best, and that's mostly because it's non-linear and you get to play as multiple characters throughout the game, not to mention that it is just an awesome game anyway. That being said, my personal favourite has to be the very first Castlevania, released in 1986. Now it is linear, but I kind of like the simplicity of the game. And when I say simplicity, I don't mean the game is simple, because no, it's hard as nails. You play the part of Simon Belmont, and it's your mission to stop Count Dracula, the evil vampire, from raining havoc upon the land with the aid of his demonic minions. You are armed only with a whip to begin with, but you do get to upgrade it throughout the game, as well as some sub-weapons like some holy water or a few daggers here and there. As I mentioned earlier, the game is hard as nails, but for me personally it adds an addictive quality and always has me coming back for more. I absolutely love the gothic aesthetics of the game, and it reminds me of the horror films from the Hammer series. The game does take a lot of patience and a lot of trial and error, but honestly it's one of the best games I've ever played. Oh, and Castlevania, by the way, has an amazing soundtrack. In fact, every installment of Castlevania that I've played has an incredible soundtrack. Now, before it branched out onto other consoles, the Castlevania series was mostly Nintendo-based, but it did make its way to the Sega Mega Drive. Or to our American friends out there,
the Sega Genesis!
With a game called Castlevania Bloodlines, which is a great game, by the way. But before that, the Sega Master System did have what's called a Castlevania clone, or if you ask me, a complete rip-off, with a game called Masters of Darkness, released in 1992. Now, compared to Castlevania, Masters of Darkness doesn't quite hold up, as the graphics aren't quite as good, although they're okay, the music is fine but it does get a bit repetitive, and the game itself is relatively easier, but that's not to say that it's a bad game. In fact, if you ask me, sometimes I kind of prefer it. The game itself is based in London, England during the 1800s, or the Victorian era if you like, and you get to face characters like Jack the Ripper. You play the part of Dr. Ferdinand Social, and you've got to stop characters like Jack the Ripper and other enemies from resurrecting Dracula from the dead. I know, a very similar story to Castlevania too, and it's almost like a spiritual sequel in a way. As far as the game mechanics are concerned, they are pretty much identical to that of Castlevania, which is why it feels so much like you are playing a Castlevania game. Honestly though, it's a solid entry and it's one that I love coming back to. Next up on the list is House of the Dead Overkill, originally released on the Nintendo Wii in 2009, although I do believe it got a release on the PlayStation 3 also. And if you like a lot of F-words and F-bombs in your gameplay, then this is the game for you. Seriously guys, I think that this game holds a record for the amount of times that that particular word is used. Just in case you weren't aware, the House of the Dead was originally an arcade series, played in the style of an on-rail or light gun shooter. Now personally, I love this style of gaming, but I love it even more when your enemies are hordes of zombies. There's not much more to say other than you have to shoot your way from one level to the next, but House of the Dead Overkill was a release especially for the home consoles. The game is played out like your characters are starring in a crappy 80s B-movie horror film, and it certainly does feel like that, especially as the acting is quite terrible at times, but I do feel like it's done on purpose for effect. After all, it does appear to be a running tradition, as the acting throughout the game series is kind of awful. The game does come with a lot of flaws though. For instance, the game is fairly easy and you can complete it in one sitting, especially as you upgrade your weapons along the way. That only makes the game easier. Personally, I like to just stick with a pistol and give myself a challenge, but even then, I can complete it in one sitting. There's not enough variation between the zombies and you will see the same ones repeated over and over throughout the game. Not that I'm offended by the F word myself, after all I've been known to use it, but it does get used so much in this game that it gets a bit tiresome. And the backstory in this game is kind of disgusting. And seriously guys, it takes a lot to disgust me, but it is a bit, I don't know, gross. With all that being said, the game is highly addictive and so much fun to play, especially when you're playing co-op and have someone next to you. I love playing this game with my wife. It's one of my favourite games to play and it's one that I dig out very, very often. Speaking of shooting zombies, I can't do a list like this without mentioning Resident Evil 2, the original release in 1998 on the PlayStation. Now, growing up as a kid, I didn't actually own a PlayStation. I was more of a Nintendo guy, as some of you have probably already worked out, but I still remember the frenzy that this game caused when it was released back in 1998. I vividly remember being in high school and our teacher was late coming to class. One of my friends pulled out this Gamers magazine and showed us this article on a new game that was about to be released called Resident Evil 2. Well, everyone was just buzzing about this game, weren't they? And we couldn't wait to play it. Now, granted, over the years, the graphics haven't particularly dated very well, but during its release, they looked amazing. We'd never seen anything like it, and we were totally excited for this game. I know a lot of people have criticized the tank controls, but during its release, it was quite revolutionary. We'd only seen it in the first Resident Evil game, and honestly, we didn't think it played that badly. We got used to it. As I mentioned, I didn't own a PlayStation, but I got to play this game a lot at a friend's house, and honestly, I couldn't get enough of it. I kept visiting his house over and over again just to play this game. In case you weren't aware, Resident Evil 2 is a survival-based horror game with lots of puzzle elements and some strategic thinking along the way. It's a very tense game with lots of pulse-pounding moments and plenty of jump scares. A game that was both fun and terrifying to play on your own. As we all know, the Resident Evil series has spun many sequels and remakes over the years with a huge cult following, but I will never forget that frenzy that it caused when it was released in 1998, Resident Evil 2, and I'm so glad that I was a part of it. What a year to have been alive. Next up on my list is Hugos House of Horrors, released in 1990, and I played this on MS-DOS. That's right, kids, I was an MS-DOS gamer. Wow, I loved playing games on MS-DOS, including this little gem. Now, let me start by saying that this is not a good game. In fact, it's terrible, but I have so much nostalgia for it. I played the heck out of it back in the day. It's very similar to the game Maniac Mansion, which deserves an honorary mention in this list. That's totally a great game, but it is kind of different and probably not as good. Hugos House of Horrors was part of a trilogy, which were kind of mystery adventure games, which were partly text-based. But the first one is the only one that really has any kind of elements of horror in it. The game mechanics are fairly simple in the fact that you control your character Hugo with the arrow keys on your keyboard, whilst also texting commands. For instance, at the beginning of the game, your character Hugo will be stood outside of a haunted mansion, and you need to get him inside. So you'll move him over to the front door with your arrow keys, and maybe type in, "open door." Spoiler alert guys, that door will not open because the game isn't that easy. You see, the game has a lot of mystery to it and a lot of puzzles to solve. But if you know the answers to those puzzles, you can complete this game in under 10 minutes. However, this game is immensely cryptic. Bear in mind that this game came out at a time where there was no internet, you'd have had no walkthroughs, barely anyone played this game, so there was no word of mouth, and I'm pretty sure it didn't get covered in any magazines. This game was really hard and it used to stress me out, but at the same time I kind of really enjoyed playing it. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a lot of nostalgia for this game, so no matter how bad it is, I still keep coming back to it. Apart from a little musical ditty at the beginning of this game, and there is a moment where you meet a dog and you hear the song "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window" played, there is no music in this game whatsoever. It's a fairly silent game, and that just kind of adds to the blandness of it. Speaking of bland, I'm sure many of you will look at this game and think, wow, the graphics have not dated particularly well. It looks really basic. Well, back in 1990, we felt that way also. The entire game looks like its graphics were drawn by one guy and programmed by that same guy, and that's because that's exactly what happened. The entire game was put together by David Gray. No, not that David Gray. And to be honest, there's something kind of admiring about that. The idea that one individual guy put this entire game together in a room somewhere on some very basic software is very, very endearing. You do kind of get the feeling that it is a labour of love, and honestly, it's very, very charming. I do like coming back to this game, despite the fact that it's not great. Another game that is not considered to be particularly great, in fact it was panned by critics, is Ju-On the Grudge on Nintendo Wii, released in 2009. People cannot stand this game. They say it's got weak graphics even for its time. The gameplay is poor, and there are only, I think, 5 levels and kind of easy to complete, but I do feel that people have approached this game in the wrong manner. Ju-On the Grudge is a first-person survival horror, or a haunted house simulator as it calls itself. The idea of this game is not to sit down and complete it from start to finish and earn achievements like other games. The idea is to try and create an atmosphere and kind of get scared. Yes, the graphics aren't great, even for its time, but they do a good enough job, and it's up to you guys to help create that tension and draw some atmosphere to your gameplay. So with that in mind, don't play this game in the day, don't play it with any distractions, don't have any music playing, make sure your phone is switched off, play it at night with the curtains drawn, and make sure there aren't many other members with you, because the more people in the room, then the less scary this is going to feel. The controls in the game are simplistic, but this isn't a skill-based game, it is a haunted house simulator. So yes, your character does move kind of slow and you have to use the Wii Remote. Your Wii Remote also acts as a torch, or a flashlight for our American friends. And at times it also plays the part of a mobile phone. Again, for our American friends, a cell phone. And those moments can be kind of cheesy but scary too, because there is a speaker on the Wii Remote, and when you do use it as a phone, you have to put the speaker to your ear, and sometimes it's kind of scary what's on the other end. I think people don't get the idea that this game is meant to be there for a couple of cheap thrills, a couple of laughs and some jump scares. It's not meant to be anything else. It's not something you're supposed to play on a regular basis, and therefore I feel it's very fit for purpose, and I do like coming back to it once in a while. Now obviously Ju-On the Grudge is based on the Grudge movie series, which is one of my favourite series actually, well, the first one anyway. But another game that's very, very similar is Slender the Arrival, which is kind of based on the Slender Man folklore. It plays in a very similar manner, you know, like first-person survivor horror, lots of puzzles to solve, haunted house simulator kind of thing. But it's an indie-based game. Again, there aren't many levels, but it's not meant to be played like other games. It's there to be, like I said, a haunted house simulator, or there to give you a cheap thrill or a jump scare. There are other games in the Slenderman series, but I haven't played those. This is the only one I've played, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, it's one that I do like to come back to, especially if I've got a couple of friends over and I want to give them a bit of a cheap scare. But I have to repeat, they must have their phone switched off. It's got to be at night with the curtains drawn, just to create that atmosphere. Loads of fun. I can't do a list like this without mentioning the game Sweet Home, released in 1989 on the Famicom and based on a Japanese horror film of the same name. I have actually done a review on this channel based on that film. If you guys want to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description. But the game itself is absolutely fantastic. Now, it's kind of a survival-based horror game, but it's also a role-playing game, which is fairly interesting because I'm not particularly into role-playing games, but I absolutely adored this one. Now, the version I played wasn't on the Famicom because the Famicom version is in Japanese, and I can't speak Japanese, I can't read Japanese. I played a fan-translated version. Apparently, you can get a physical copy of this on the NES, but there are other ways to play it, which I won't mention due to legalities or whatever, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the game is fairly tough, and you're meant to be playing the part of 5 individual characters who are trapped in a haunted house. You're meant to be there filming a documentary, but something happens, and then you have to solve a mystery to get out. The game is fairly grueling and you will die playing it first time, and if your characters die in this game, there is no way to bring them back. As I said before, it is a role-playing game, so there are elements in this game that you will expect from other role-playing games. But because it's horror-based, that is really what drew my attention. And honestly, I love the story too. It's very loosely based on the story of the film, but it kind of has its own character. There is so much to this game, lots of hidden rooms and items. Your characters have their own attributes, which is really handy in a game like this. And lots of mystery to the game too. It really did kind of suck me in, and honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed playing it. It took me a long time to complete it, but I did eventually do so. Eventually? Eventually. I did eventually do so. Can't speak, I'm tongue-tied. Well, I could go on forever and mention tons of other horror-based games, but I'm just going to mention one more. Well, kind of two. My favourite horror-based game of all time has to be Doom, released by id Software in 1993, as well as Doom 2 in 1995. Now, essentially, they kind of play the same way as each other and are basically the same game, which is why I love them equally. But my God, when this game came out, it just absolutely blew my mind. It's one of those early first-person shooters, and yes, it may have dated to, say, younger audience today, but for me, it still feels immensely fresh. I remember when this game came out, and it just blew everyone's minds. The story is you are playing the part of a Marine training on Mars, and all hell breaks loose. Literally, demons come out from hell and just completely invade this planet, and you have to get from one point to another in each level, and sometimes you have to find keys, so it's not just a straight line, you have to find secret entrances and different kind of doorways. But my God, the action is immense in this game. I don't know how else to explain it. You are just shooting hordes of demons from one level to another, and it's just pumping. It's brilliant. The soundtrack is amazing, the layouts are amazing, the enemies are amazing, the weapons that you use are fantastic. I cannot praise this game enough. It's spun multiple sequels over the years, but for me, nothing will compete to the first two. I love the third one, by the way, and it's a good way to, say, play 1 and 2, because I think if you play Doom 3 on the Xbox 360, it was like a special edition, was it the BFG edition? You can unlock Doom 1 and 2, so that's a great way to play it. But I played it back in the day on MS-DOS, and I will never forget my first experience and just thinking, wow, I've never seen anything like this. And for those of you that think the game is dated, I guarantee you that this game can still give you scares. It really can. Play it in the dark with headphones on. Just like make sure you are on your own, and I swear to God this game still gives me chills. It's still scary and it still holds up. Well guys, that is all we've got time for in this episode. What did you think of this, by the way? Bear in mind that this is not a gamers channel, this is a horror channel, but there are tons of other horror-based games that I can talk about. Is this something that you would like to see more of? Let me know in the comments section. And guys, I want to know what horror-based games you love. What are your favorites? They don't have to be retro, that's just my opinion, by the way. You know, are there any kind of modern ones that I should check out? Let me know. Do you agree with some of the games in this list? Do you disagree? What games would you put in your list? Please speak to me, talk to me in the comment section, guys. Have you played any of the games that I've mentioned in this video? And if so, what emotions did you get? Did you share the same emotions as me, or did you get a complete different reaction? Let me know, speak to me. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Right guys, I'm heading off. I'm gonna watch, I don't know, a horror film. That's what I do. And until next time. I don't know who they are, but if you don't subscribe, they will get you. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't done so already. Make sure you click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new video here on Monster Gab. Like the video if you did indeed like it, and as I mentioned before, leave a comment below. Share with your friends, and thank you so much for stopping by. Take care, see you soon.